Nobody did the reading, and now the whole empire's gone. Typical. Seriously. The Roman Empire lasted basically 1,000 years, survived wars, plagues, and its own government being a complete mess, and historians still can't agree on the one thing that finally killed it. Spoiler. It's because nothing killed it. Everybody just quietly stopped doing their part. For literally centuries, historians have thrown out theory after theory. Economic collapse, barbarian invasions, political chaos, disease, lead poisoning somehow. Over 200 different explanations have been proposed for why Rome fell, and depending on which historian you ask, you'll get a completely different answer. So today we're going through the actual leading theories, and by the end, you'll understand why this is less one villain did it, and more, everyone quietly stopped showing up. Quick thing before we get into this. If you're new here, we cover ancient history like this every week. Real sources, zero boring lecture energy. Hit follow now so you don't miss the next one. What the fall of Rome even means. First, we need to clear something up because most people think the fall of Rome was one dramatic moment. Barbarians kick down the gate, city burns, credits roll. That's not what happened. The Roman Empire didn't fall in a day. It didn't even fall in a decade. This was a slow-motion, centuries-long unraveling, and honestly, calling it the fall of Rome is a little misleading because only half of it actually fell. Around 285 AD, the empire got split into two halves, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, because it had gotten too massive for one government to manage effectively. The western half, based around Rome itself, is the one that eventually collapses in 476 AD. The eastern half? That one keeps going. It becomes the Byzantine Empire, and it survives for almost another 1,000 years, until 1453. So when people say Rome fell, really only one half of a two-part group project actually went under. The other half just quietly rebranded and kept working. So the real question isn't, why did Rome fall? It's, why did the western half specifically fall apart when the eastern half didn't? And that's where things get messy, because historians point to a bunch of different culprits. Let's start with the one that shows up in basically every version of this story: money. So one major theory is straight-up economic collapse. Rome had a massive military to fund, an enormous territory to maintain, and, at some point, the government basically ran out of money to pay for any of it properly. So what do? They start debasing the currency, meaning they cut the amount of actual silver in Roman coins and just hoped nobody would notice. People noticed. Prices skyrocketed. Trade got unstable because nobody trusted the money was actually worth what it claimed to be worth. Imagine your entire economy running on gift cards that quietly lose value every time you're not looking. That's basically what happened to the Roman currency system over decades. And once people stop trusting the money, they stop trading efficiently. Taxes get harder to collect, and the whole financial engine of the empire starts sputtering. On top of that, the empire had gotten so used to funding itself through conquest. New territory meant new resources, new slaves, new tax bases. But by this point, Rome had basically stopped expanding. No new territory coming in meant no new economic influx, and all the old problems just kept compounding with nothing new to paper over them. So the economy's falling apart. Cool, cool, cool. But that's not even the problem everyone talks about first. Let's get into the one most people already assume is the whole story: the invasions. This is the version most people already know. Barbarians showed up and Rome fell. But it's way more complicated than invaders bad, empire dead. Rome's borders at its peak stretched from modern-day Britain all the way to the Middle East. That is an enormous amount of territory for one military to defend, especially once the economy funding that military is already struggling. So the empire starts relying more and more heavily on mercenaries, meaning, ironically, they start hiring the exact groups they're supposedly fighting to help defend the borders. Which sounds fine in theory until those hired groups realize they have way more leverage than a group of guys just doing a job for pay. Some of these commanders end up more loyal to their own troops or their own ambitions than to Rome itself, which becomes a massive problem later. Then you've got actual sustained pressure from groups like the Visigoths, who at one point straight up sacked the city of Rome in 410 AD. which symbolically is a massive deal, even though the empire technically survives it. And by 476 AD, a Germanic leader named Odoacer removes the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, and doesn't even bother replacing him with another emperor. That's usually the date textbooks point to as the fall. But by that point, the empire had already been weakened by decades of economic and political problems. The invasions were less a random catastrophe and more like someone finally pushing over a building that had already been structurally compromised for years. And here's the part that made this whole situation even worse. While all of this is happening, Rome's own government was an absolute mess. Let's talk about the politics. So, during a stretch known as the crisis of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire went through over 20 emperors in about 50 years. 20. In 50 years. For comparison, that's the political stability of a group chat where everyone keeps getting voted out of the friend group and replaced by whoever yells the loudest. Most of these emperors didn't die of old age peacefully in bed. They were assassinated, overthrown by their own generals, or killed in civil wars against rival claimants to the throne. Every time this happens, you lose continuity, you lose institutional stability, and worst of all, you lose focus. Because instead of dealing with the actual economic and military problems piling up at the borders, Rome's leadership was constantly busy fighting each other for the throne. It's genuinely hard to fix an empire-wide financial crisis or coordinate a border defense strategy when the guy in charge might get stabbed by his own bodyguards next month. Nobody's thinking long-term when the position itself is basically a death sentence with a nice hat. And every time power changed hands violently, it created openings. For rival generals to try their own coups, for regional governors to act more independently, for the whole system to fragment even further instead of pulling together. And if a collapsing economy, constant invasions, and a government that couldn't stop killing itself wasn't enough, Rome also had to deal with this next one, which almost nobody brings up first, but historians increasingly think mattered a lot more than people realized. So on top of everything else, Rome got hit by multiple devastating plagues. The Antonine Plague, and later the Plague of Cyprian, which wiped out a significant chunk of the population at various points. Fewer people means fewer farmers, fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, and fewer workers to keep the entire economic machine running. It's really hard to defend a border or fund a government when a huge percentage of your working population is just gone. On top of the plagues, there's also growing evidence of a shift in climate during this period. Colder, more unpredictable weather patterns that hurt agricultural output right when the empire needed every resource it could get. Bad harvests, food shortages, and population decline all stacked on top of the economic and political chaos already happening. It's less like one disaster and more like every single system failing at the exact same time, each one making the others worse. So here's the actual answer to why historians can't agree. It's because there isn't one single cause. This is why the group project comparison actually works so well. Nobody single-handedly tanked this project. The economy team stopped doing their part. The military team got stretched too thin and started outsourcing the work to people with their own agendas. The leadership team was too busy fighting each other for credit to actually manage anything. And then, on top of all of that, an unexpected health crisis and bad weather hit at the worst possible time. Any one of these problems on its own, Rome probably survives it. The empire had weathered plenty of individual crises before. It's the fact that all of them hit at once over an extended period, each one making the others worse, that actually took the whole thing down. The eastern half of the empire dealt with some of these same pressures too, but had more centralized wealth, stronger walls around its capital, and better political continuity. So it held on for another 1,000 years. The West just didn't have those advantages left by the time everything piled up. So next time somebody tells you Rome fell because of one dramatic invasion, you can tell them it was actually a 1,000-year group project where basically every department quietly stopped doing their part at the same time. If your history class only gave you the barbarian version, follow. We cover ancient history like this every week. Comment which empire, civilization, or historical mess you want investigated next because, trust me, Rome was not the only ancient institution running on pure chaos. And if you want to see what a two-person love triangle turned political alliance looks like instead of an entire empire falling apart, check out the Cleopatra video linked right here.